And we're live. Hey, folks. Zach Osterman, Indianapolis Star, Mike Niziolek, Louisiana Herald Times. You might have forgotten. It's been a while since you've seen us. This is Mind Your Banners for June 25th, 2025. Mike, I don't know that I want to go back and look at the last time we did one of these. It has been a while. It's been quiet, in fairness. There has not been a galloping amount of news to discuss on the IU front, which really, I suppose, is probably what you want if you're a college athletics department around this time of year. It's probably not the best thing in the world to be making a ton of news in the summer months. But I did want to get into a few different things with you. Talk a little football, talk a little revenue sharing. We are a week away from the official start of the rev share era. How are you? We have not seen each other in person in quite some. I think maybe Little Five was the last time. Was that right?
No, it was Hubert. It was.
Oh, that's right. Hubert.
We had the lovely drive together. You were in such a good mood as you took in the sights and sounds down to where is
I
it?
know that it's in Borden. I know that drive all too well. I've done it many times. And listen, it's a nice drive. It's just like it's feel like you're racing the sun to get back up 37 before it just gets dark because those state roads get dark at night. But really, that's probably the last time there was major IU news. And again, I think, there's probably an extent to which you'd prefer that if you're Indiana, right? Like this is a time of year when you shouldn't be making a ton of news. Indiana added a player who's going to join. You wrote about this. I was on vacation last week. Joined the program near the end of the summer, eating up a 12th scholarship and presumably kind of closing the door on at least one of Anthony Leal or Luke Goody. Both of those processes have been pretty tight-lipped throughout. If there are updates, I think it's clear at this point they're just going to kind of come ad hoc, that the NCAA is not moving with some sort of formal timeline. I think just because there are so many of these waivers to sort through, because so many more players are asking for extra years for a variety of reasons. But it has been remarkable just kind of how quiet it's been. And I think from Indiana's perspective, I think that's probably preferable.
Yeah, summer workouts have started for both men's basketball and football. Obviously, the team kind of all the freshmen are now on campus, and you don't want to hear any injury news or things like that leaking out. Anytime you can kind of get through summer without unscathed, that's a good thing. Obviously we have Big Ten Media Days coming up for football in July, and that sort of marks like the start of the calendar, really. But like you said, kind of the overall overarching sort of thing, kind of in the background of it all, has been the revenue sharing and how that would all shake out. And then, a couple weeks ago, you finally get the final decision. And I think that sort of takes some of the weight off administrators and coaching staffs to some extent about what the future kind of looks like.
So that is probably a good place to start. We had a story today talking to Scott Dolson about how Indiana plans to break up the $20.5 million. I guess first, just like a refresher, in year one, everyone's rev share budget is a maximum of $20.5 million. That is, you don't have to max that out, and obviously a lot of smaller schools probably won't. Max schools, etc. Big Ten schools will. You can share $2.5 million of that in extra scholarships if you want, but that counts against your cap. So that takes just the physical money that you can just hand back to players essentially as payments would go down to $18 million at that point. Some schools are adding scholarships, some are not. Indiana is not at this point. I don't know that Indiana's closing the door on doing that at some point in the future, but for the moment they're not. All this starts July 1. Basically, every athlete that's going to be on a revenue sharing agreement on July 1 signed it weeks or months ago. Like, they were recruiting athletes through the fall, winter, spring to the idea of revenue sharing under the presumption that it would eventually come in. And as you said, the House settlement was finally approved. That's also going to bring in the NIL clearinghouse, and we can talk a little bit about that. I think that's maybe a bit of a point of, well, it's certainly a point of contention. I think it's something that I don't know if everyone kind of grabbed that or grasped that as fully as just the understanding of strict revenue sharing. But those are kind of the bones of it. And Scott Dolson, kind of chatted with us about it. Schools, most of them are loath to give hard numbers for a variety of reasons, but he did kind of talk in general percentages. Indiana is going to put, I think, somewhere just south of 75% of that $20.5 million. Again, Indiana is going to share all of that as just straight payments. They're going to put just under 75% of that, I think, into football, which is a pretty standard number. 75 was about the number that most schools had settled on. That's over $15 million. It's about 15. It's just a tick under 15.4. Indiana's going to come in at about 20% to men's basketball, which is probably on the higher end. The number I had seen was like 15 to 20%, basically. The presumption being probably more places would be a little closer to 15. Some of the football schools that want to emphasize basketball will be closer to 20. There will be, I think, some Big East schools that go north of that number, but those are obviously schools that, even if they're not maxing out the $20.5 million in rev share, don't have football to feed. So the expectation is that there are going to be a number of Big East programs that probably have the biggest rev share budgets in the country, or at least among the biggest. The next two sports after that will be women's basketball and volleyball, which shouldn't really be surprising. Those are probably your two biggest revenue generating, non-revenue generating sports, if you know what I mean, in terms of how much money they're making annually, even if they aren't always turning a profit in sport specific, revenue minus expense. And then there will be kind of a small remainder. I think the term that Dolson used was sprinkled across the rest of Indiana sports. I know when Mike Babinski talked to Nathan Baird, our Purdue writer, about the same topic this week, he described that fund as basically almost targeted at opportunities to go recruit elite athletes in specific sports. So if Indiana sees like an absolute star soccer player and needs a little money to try and tempt that player to Bloomington, I think that's maybe a little bit what Indiana's looking at with that. But I would say very few surprises. Football got the bulk of it. Basketball, obviously with the help of NIL, is going to have one of the most robust budgets in the Big Ten, if not nationally, this year. And then women's basketball, volleyball, and the rest of it just kind of trickling down.
Yeah, and when I had talked to Scott Dolson the week before the decision was finalized, and he said kind of the biggest component, like, none of this is a surprise. None of this is they weren't like, basically they were going down this track, and he said this with deference to the courts, but like they had already moved so far along, basically all the power conferences on the revenue sharing and the structure, like this was happening, right? Like the framework was going to happen basically, and through, I don't know if it would have been this exact one, but like they were ready, they had long been ready. And so like this part was sort of the like easy part because it was all basically done, right? I think the biggest part of the settlement, and what coaches and administrators are hoping, and you mentioned the NIL clearinghouse, that provides some sort of stability and takes away sort of a lot of the uncertainty, because if that did not go, if that wasn't in place, then NIL would remain sort of this, and it might be, it might not work, but we will see in terms of like fundraising and focus on generating money for that component of things. That was a big deal for athletic departments, and so this sort of lessens the pressure a little bit, and provides some important structure. And there's been debates obviously over whether this will work or whether teams will sort of follow the intent of it and all that. But they're hopeful that this will sort of put some, like I said, I guess structure would be, or obviously regulations, but structure in place that sort of helps athletic departments out and kind of takes that burden off of them.
Yeah, I mean, to your point about, what you said about Dolson, kind of saying like we were going ahead with this kind of no matter what. Like we were in a situation similar to NIL 4 years ago, where there were some states that were passing laws basically saying revenue sharing starts July 1, irrespective of the House settlement. And so we were going to wind up in a world where, in theory, the NCAA said you can't share revenue without a settlement. But then there were states, there would be schools in states where they could say, well, NCAA rules don't preempt states' laws. We're going to start sharing revenue. I do think when I
said him, when he said, he was saying like we, like the Big Ten and power conference, not just
yeah.
I do want to delineate that Indiana was just going to go rogue here. It was the entire college athletics. It was done. Like they had teams. This wasn't like with 20.5 being such a big number. This took months and more than 12 months to sort of get everything in place, and that's what all these teams had done. So
and I think I do suspect that we're gonna see some parallels to the way NIL unfolded. If you remember those first like 24 months, where at first it was like, he's doing Twitter advertisements for pizza chains, and like, isn't that interesting? And I remember talking to a couple people who run small businesses who were in like open doors, those portals and things, saying that like athletes were basically their opening ask for endorsements was like in 5 figures, and no one had any idea how that market was supposed to work. And of course, it's kind of developed a little bit out of control. And I think I do want to come on to talking about some of the clearinghouse and some of the key differences with like NIL versus rev share. But I do think, and I got this sense talking to Dolson this week, there is a real expectation that everyone is just going to have to kind of be nimble for a while. Like, like Dolson said, Indiana is already working on kind of its year 2 projections, because it's the rev share number is 20.5. It goes up by 4% next year, then another 4% compounded the year after. Then in year 4, they'll kind of, tinker with it, adjust it. I mean, the expectation is it's just going to keep going up. I think within 10 years, everybody thinks we'll probably cross the $30 million dollar threshold. A lot of that number seems to be based on basically athletics. The theory is they got together and they figured out what the average revenue was for a Power 4 athletics department. They cut that in half because in the pro model, typically you split, like the NFL, I think, is the one where you split the TV deal, right? Like you just like it half goes to the players, half goes to the owners. So they split that in half. And then they said there is already payment to athletes in the form of scholarships. So we're going to pull that money out. And the number they got to was 20.5. That number is expected to continue going up because ultimately television contract revenue, especially, or at least for the big conferences, is expected to keep going up for the time being. So everyone's working.
Was it the Alston payment, the academic?
Yeah, you can. Yeah, I think you can build Alston payments into your 20.5 if you want to, similar to how you can build the scholarship money in. But I don't know anyone who's doing that. If I'm not mistaken, like back at the very beginning, if I'm remembering rightly, there was a carve out for converting some of the rev share money to Alston payments, but I think basically everyone's thought is why.
Yeah, it's just
it's not like you have some sort of like rampant problem with athletes flunking out of school anyway. And the Alston payments are a totally separate thing. Like that's the Supreme Court case from 2021. That is, we don't need to get into it today, but basically, I think the feeling everyone had was like, just why? Like, why not just share it in straight revenue? I think there's a more compelling argument for adding scholarships in certain sports and paying athletes that way. But it even as everyone kind of knows what the number is and how it's supposed to build, at least for the first 3 years or so, I think there is a distinct feeling that a lot of the lessons learned in NIL about flexibility and being able to sort of be quick on your feet about adjusting to different things. I think a lot of people think they're going to be sort of drawing back on those here in the next 12 to 24 months as well, because I it's probably not going to be quite as sort of, I hate using this term, but like Wild West as NIL was, but we're going to get into this and find some things that need to be changed probably pretty quickly.
Well, I think you've seen, and I think people should trace a lot of the moves IU has made over the last 12 months as a direct response to revenue sharing. The mascot is that. It's a money-making opportunity, personal seat donations. I went back, I was looking at that. It was 2.5 to 3.3 million in additional revenue. Like all the, obviously they had a wave of cuts. Like all these are basically just directly tied to the idea of like we got, you talk about nimble, but like adjust get our overhead down, bring in more revenue, because now we have this bill coming, and like you said, it's going to go up every year. So we need more revenue. We need to account for that, and so I think you're going to continue to see they're adding more premium seats, sections to the stadium. They kind of and a club, and trying to monetize every different thing to try to do what they can to cover this extra overhead.
And this is, I think, probably where the clearinghouse sort of intersects with this more meaningfully, because a lot of kind of the frustration with NIL in general over these first 4 years is that it has become kind of this, like, almost like this inflationary market spiraling ever upward, that there's no ceiling on it. There's no sense of basically value settling out. The idea behind the clearinghouse is every NIL deal over $600 in value will have to be submitted to the clearinghouse and will get a what is called a fair market value analysis by Deloitte. Deloitte is going to provide that sort of that.
Why was it in quotes?
Because that's the term they've been using, fair market value.
Well, but it seems like you're being like
the laser.
That's what they're saying. It is
like that is the NCAA's term.
Yeah, I know, but you made it.
I think it's important. I think it's important to mark it out, because I suspect that term is going to be mentioned prominently in legal filings.
Sure, but adding the quotations in the air made it sound like you're being sarcastic.
I'm trying to note it as something specific, language specific to what the clearinghouse's purpose is set out to be.
Like Zach Osterman, IU insider. See, it makes it sound like I'm saying you're not that inside. You know what I'm saying?
Basically, moving on. Basically, Deloitte will kind of provide this auditing process, and it will be that process that says either A, the money that's being the value of this deal monetarily matches up to basically the expectations on the athlete relative to that athlete's, again, to use that term, fair market value, and then it will get approved, or the auditing process will say
it's basically just to create legitimate marketing deals that are like,
yes, it is to try and stop what is essentially developed around NIL, which is just money gathering in collectives and being dispersed for nominal amounts of work or effort or services rendered to basically just pay athletes eye-watering sums of money to come play for your favorite team, whatever it is. And listen, there are all kinds of questions about this. I don't know anyone who doesn't expect some kind of legal challenge to the fair market value process and the idea of whether basically why any NCAA construction is allowed to determine what an athlete's value is, or to tell an athlete how much money they can or can't make. There are already also people wondering about workarounds. I think, if I understand it right, one of the ones that I think some schools, I think that the feeling is perhaps some of our friends down south have begun to explore is converting collectives into like agencies and then basically just hiring athletes as talent. And in the same way that like an agency would represent an athlete to go find, commercial partners at the pro level, or at least a similar relationship. And then it becomes something where, how does a clearinghouse govern that? Because at that point, but again, that would open up employment status. And I mean, this is where it's all going to get complicated. I think the first big battleground, though, is going to be whether or not the clearinghouse and its process can stand up to legal scrutiny, because I don't have a lot of sympathy for college athletics writ large around this, in the sense that it spent so many years making money hand over fist and swearing there was not enough to pay its players. What I will say in the here and now is I do sympathize with athletic directors who are trying to figure out how to clear a $20 million hole in their budget while also funneling 8 figures in donor dollars to collectives. And if one market gets to be regulated, that being revenue sharing, there's a cap that everyone agrees upon and everybody works with the same budget, and you can move it around and different people will have different strategies. And then there's a market that's just kind of completely, again, like just totally inflationary and not really reflective of what, what it like, I mean, let's use the term true market value. I don't see how that doesn't have some pretty ugly financial outcomes for college athletics fairly quickly. And I'm talking about cutting sports. I'm talking about, shrinking scholarships, because at the end of the day, and we talk about this stuff, and I think it doesn't matter until you see it play out in real life. There are basically just 2 sports that make money in college athletics. There is value,
and you did not. There will be Title IX challenges to all this as well, and so
those have seemed so far to be targeted toward the settlement, not
right, revenue sharing,
and that's another layer of it that I am not at all smart. And I think this is something else people kind of lost track of is, there is a, what is it, like $2.6 billion settlement that's backdated to, I think, 2016, which is the beginning of the career. It's backdated to the beginning of the careers that brought the suit in the House case. And I think it's essentially, if it's not a class action that's similar to it, if you were an athlete in any of those years, you can apply for a share of that settlement and it will be dispersed to you. The NCAA and all its member conferences are kind of sharing that financial burden on a sort of a staggered basis. I think for the bigger conferences in particular, a lot of that money is going to come out of TV deals. So again, if you're an athletics director and Hooperazzi says the ADs are the same people saying they didn't have the cash to pay the players, I get that. But they've still got a constituency to serve now, which is their athletes. And, it sort of arguing about who blew a hole in the side of the ship doesn't matter as much as trying to keep it from sinking. You know what I mean? Like we can apportion blame once we can figure out a way just to not lose so much of what is recognizable. And I think it's fair to say enjoyable about college sports. And that is where I have a lot of skepticism around the clearinghouse itself, but I do understand the sentiment for needing to find a way to pull some of this in and get a little bit more control over some of this, particularly on the NIL side, because it is not a bottomless pit of money. And I do think you will start seeing opportunities taken away from athletes in very specific ways, cutting scholarships, cutting sports. If you have to keep funding a growing pot of revenue sharing money while also pushing so much of your donor money over to NIL.
Yeah, but I do think the problem is, and you mentioned it, the idea that the minute you got to get the system in place, teams are looking to game the system. It's like that's the philosophy that got us to this point. And so it's like, you get the rules, and then we're like, well, how do we bend them to then give us a competitive advantage? It's just going to make the whole house of cards collapse. And so it's, look, if everybody wanted to get this fixed, they could. I mean, it's just, you make them, employees, and that's it. But I mean, they're so reluctant to do that. That's a whole nother discussion. But the idea then,
well, but I think it is somewhat relevant to this. Like, I do think it's relevant to this in a lot of ways. Like, no, the idea of like a lot of the argument against like full employment status is.
No, I'm saying that would be the only way to sort of make this, all this to go away. They don't want to do it, but then the idea that they have these solutions and then they don't even really, teams are going to pay lip service to the NIL clearinghouse and still try to find ways around it is what got them into this problem in the first place, because that's how collectives started up. Basically, like, how do we funnel more money into players and make it look legitimate, even though obviously these aren't what that wasn't sort of the intention of NIL, right?
No. I mean, I think I talked to one college coach about a year ago who said that like there was a study done, or somehow the data was collected that suggested that in the average NIL deal, it was like 80-20, 85-15, like 15 to 20% of the money within the NIL deal was legitimate. Like, this is what this athlete should be earning based on their success, based on their public profile, their social media reach, etc., their cultural relevance, their fair market value. And the other 80 to 85% was just, steroids, was just money meant to balloon the deal to get the athlete to come play for whoever. And that's, again, like, you can say the athletes deserve the money, and that's fine, but that money's got to come from somewhere. That's the issue here, is that money's got to come from somewhere. The cash pot does bottom out eventually. It does. And, I think a lot of people don't want to go down the employment route because all politics, I'm not trying to be philosophical here, but like, all politics are short term, and that would probably be 12 to 24 months of real headache trying to figure out like how that changes the athlete school relationship, how to deal with collective bargaining, because the needs of a Big Ten football player are different if you want to go horizontally to the needs of a Big Ten volleyball player, or if you want to go vertically to the needs of a Big Sky football player. So how do you build collective bargaining arrangements with all of these different constituencies? But like, number one, I would point out we have 200 years of labor law in this country debate. Like, we kind of created NIL out of nothing. Like, we just sort of created this vague idea that athletes should be able to profit.
And they've already had 18 months of a headache. I mean, like, this has not been like the smoothest process. Like, I mean, it's how much of a fortune have they spent on lawyers to begin with? It's not like it's been smooth sailing.
I've used this analogy. It's like when your car's breaking down and the mechanic tells you it'll be $4,000 to fix it, or they can do something for $700 just to get it running again that day. And you don't want to swallow the big, like the painful pill, but instead you're just going to keep dumping cash into it and eventually have to fix it anyway. That's where it feels like we are with that. Like, it feels like we are going to keep kicking this can down the road until we literally can't anymore. And so we will have, to your point, there's already been a ton of headache, a ton of complication. Every time Congress holds one of these hearings, it feels like a bunch of performative, exercises so that representatives from, Southwest Georgia can get on the microphone and go Dogs, and then nothing happens. There's no advancement at all. I would not hold out for Congress's help. It just feels like it is going to be painful anyway. So just rip the Band-Aid off and try to do it. But, I mean, it is complicated. It is complicated. I'm not trying to diminish it, because you would have, I mean, it would be an elephant of a problem to solve. But I do think you'd be better off just trying to tackle it all than just these constant half measures that are going to just create another headache and another one and another one. But, like I said, that's where it starts to turn real philosophical, and we don't need to we don't need to kind of go down that wormhole.
No, but I think, look, coaches, and administrators are hopeful that this will work, and we'll see, and this will provide the regulation kind of needed to at least, kind of get us through here in the short term and see where it's at. Like you said, who knows in 12 months where things sit with this. I know, based on national reporting, like deals are already I think the clearinghouse was up and running like what, 2 days after the decision or something like that. So, I mean, deals are already being submitted through there.
I should say, and I know we've talked about this before, but like athletes, almost everyone, presumably, who will be an athlete in 25-26 signed an NIL deal before the clearinghouse went into effect. So, like this year's athletes will be on the old way of NIL. We're talking about moving forward because I think the rule was basically the day the clearinghouse was established was the start date for deals needing to be submitted, if that makes sense.
Do you know how the payments work for that? Did they have to be paid out by the July 1st, or just like the deal had to be signed and like done?
Yeah, there were a lot of questions about this, and I never
saw clarity on that. Like,
I never found anyone who had a firm answer.
Was it like all like upfront, and so you could avoid like because if you got paid after July 1st, well, then wouldn't it be?
Yeah.
Well, like I don't know how that, but it doesn't matter, I guess. But
the thing, honestly, the clearest thing I heard was just that NIL deals signed before the clearinghouse went into effect were not subject to the clearinghouse. So I know there were people talking about like front loading deals, and if you're going to get like $100,000, that 90,000 of that would get paid out before July 1st.
Right.
But it seemed like the firmest answer to those questions I got was just that the day the settlement was signed would be the day that, from the NCAA's perspective,
those new deals
went into effect.
Well, all athletes too are signing revenue contracts that revenue share contracts too. Those are separate.
Yeah. No, those are totally separate. Like NIL and rev share, they live in the same neighborhood. They are both athlete compensation, but like in theory, beyond the establishment of the clearinghouse and that process, they don't affect each other. Now, obviously, I think coaches will try to find creative ways to balance the two, and maybe certain athletes for certain reasons get, a lot more rev share, and certain athletes are pushed more NIL, whatever. But like money an athlete gets from NIL is not somehow affected by money they get from revenue sharing legally, or according to like established rules and policy. Those are two separate forms of income. It'll just be a question of like how they're negotiated between athletes and their representation and then schools. So, listen, it's going to be, we've been talking about it now for 30 minutes, and I feel like we're just scratching the surface. Like, it's going to be incredibly complicated. There are going to be a bunch of moments when, and it was this way with NIL too, where we look like 6 months into the past and realize what we thought was best practice around something revenue sharing related was actually not at all. Was like, oh, why were schools ever doing that? Rules and policy will evolve. State laws will affect some of it. I'm still skeptical about congressional action, but I think that college athletics leaders will keep pushing for it. And I think that's pretty much where we are. Should we talk about actual sports for a little bit?
Sports.
IU football. Fire the laser. That's one for the teenagers. It is fair to say, I think, actually, that Indiana football is not really fighting for respect this summer in quite the way I thought it might be. There was a distinct, obviously, listen, we don't need to rehash everything, all the talking points from the playoff last year. But I think there was a feeling kind of at the tail end of that Indiana was, sort of one of that Indiana was like a wonderful story that had ended in a lot of ways in the eyes of college football. But actually, and I think this is a credit to Curt Cignetti and his staff and the track record. I think it's also just a credit to people looking at the players that they brought in. The way they reloaded the offensive line, obviously the quarterback position, defensive line potentially, some players they were able to keep hold of either out of the draft or out of the portal. Fisher, Pons, Sarrett, Cooper, Kamara, etc. I actually think that college football at large thinks Indiana might be a bit of a problem again this season. And I think there's pointing at the schedule and justifiably saying it looks harder. Of course, we thought last season's schedule was a lot more difficult than it turned out to be. But I do just get the sense that Indiana's not sneaking up on anybody this year, that for a variety of different reasons, as spring has sort of turned into summer, Indiana has gained some respect nationally that I think people believe this team's going to be a problem, at least, if not maybe a playoff contender again.
I don't know if problem's the right word. I think that they don't expect them to take like a fall off like they did last time they had success. I think that's I think they've earned the respect that they're not going to sort of disappear into the night. I think the schedule is a problem because I think by nature, look, even if Iowa, Oregon, and Penn State aren't as good as they were last year, those are still difficult places to play. Those are road games. And
you can feel better about like the competitive floor of the schedule, I think, this year.
Yeah. And so I still think when you kind of look at the schedule, like, is 8-4, 9-3 just as it would be a marker of success because based on what they have in front of them, probably would a 9-3 maybe still put them in competition or even in discussion of the playoffs? It's possible depending on where those wins come from. I do think that, like you said, their roster is in a good spot. When you don't lose anybody that won all Big Ten honors that had eligibility left, that's a win. That's a huge win. They kept, I think one part that's kind of, you've talked a lot about Derek Owings, you wrote about it, but the idea of keeping the staff together outside of Tino Sinceri, I think was a huge deal. You don't have to sort of reboot there either. And so I think your continuity has obviously been kind of a key component of his success throughout the years in terms of keeping his staff together. And I think you see that here. And I think that's a big deal.
And I think I think it's kind of one of those things where you treat these two things like they're in a vacuum, where you say like, well, Cignetti's coaches love to stay with him. And then you see, well, it's great that his coaches stayed. I think after a while you say, well, there's got to be a reason for that. There's got to be a reason why Brian Haynes and Indiana, to its credit, I think to its enormous credit, Indiana pushed serious money into keeping the staff together, keeping the infrastructure together, around football. Like I know we all kind of had a round of sit-down interviews with Curt Cignetti. One of the things I talked to him about, one of the things he brought up kind of on his own with staff continuity, he said it's not just the assistants. The recruiting department's the same, strength and conditioning department, and again, not just Owings, but like all of his assistant coaches, assistant strength coaches are still here. Like there is continuity kind of across the entire organization. And this, it is on a macro level, similar to why I think a lot of people are optimistic about Fernando Mendoza with this team. There is an established track record that says when Curt Cignetti is given that kind of staff continuity and that kind of like year over year, sort of sustained success or sustained support, it yields success. And often it yields, pretty substantial success. When you look at particularly, we talk a lot about like the whole body of work for Curt Cignetti, and I think justifiably. But like I would point out, this is a coach who is now in his last 6 years never finished worse than second in his conference. Like that's, and 3 of those years were at the FCS level, 2 of those years were in the Sun Belt, 1 was in the Big Ten. But after a while, you just have to kind of recognize like what he's capable of when you give him the resources and when he has that continuity, when he has people around him that understand his working process, that have been with him for a while. And of course it will roll over some, maybe in 5 years we're talking about Chandler Whitmer as, a Signetti guy in a way that we used to talk about Tina with. I don't know. But I think what you have seen in a variety of different ways, not least your strength coach turning down Southern Cal to stay at Indiana, which culturally speaking is just not something that ever happens. I think that the respect for Kurt Signetti and his process and his track record of success is outweighing the sort of reflexive cultural doubt people are going to have about a program like Indiana being able to sustain success when history tells us it's incredibly difficult to here.
Yeah, and I think we'll get early answers. I mean, obviously after I think that Illinois game will be sort of a big moment in terms of, trying to kind of build on that momentum. Look, their non-conference schedule stinks, but that game against Illinois will be a big one in terms of, they're a team obviously that has high expectations too and wants to sort of take that jump. I think a returning quarterback, and to sort of put that one to bed. And then I think Iowa's next after that, right? I think you have kind of back-to-back tests there that will say, like, where this team is at, where they're headed. Hoop Rotzi mentioned the injuries, and I think part of that is owing, you have to have a good sort of system in place to try to avoid.
I think Signetti certainly believes it is.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like that, we'll see.
But on the flip side is there is some luck involved too, right?
Yeah.
The idea that you could make it out, Drew Evans, I think, was like the first sort of starter to miss his start outside of a targeting suspension in the half. And that came
no, I mean, Indiana did have one very prominent injury, which I think it's fair to say affected them all season, which is Curtis Rourke.
Well, yes, but I'm saying missed a game. I guess Rourke missed the week before that, but they only had one guy, two starts basically, out of all both sides of the ball from injuries, and so that's and he knocks on wood every time he talks about injuries. That's why, and you don't get a season like that often. I mean, that's a really some of that, like I said, is a credit to their strength and conditioning program, but you got to get lucky too, and that was a big deal last year.
You mentioned the schedule. Like, one thing I found myself saying a lot when people ask about it, because I mean, this is when, like, it feels like the radio shows start doing summer check-ins and start kind of building toward media days and then the season, is that the schedule sets up really nicely. You have 3 games that, for all intents and purposes, for Indiana should be preseason games. I mean, Old Dominion, Kennesaw State. Indiana should win those comfortably. Maybe you have a bit of an FIU against Old Dominion, but Indiana should be winning those games. If they're not, then this whole conversation is irrelevant. Then your first big test is at home, which I think is really helpful, because I think Illinois is a good team. There's a part of me that wonders if Illinois is also just getting credit because it's an old team, and ultimately, like, you don't see a lot of those in college football anymore because of the portal and roster churn. But they did win 10 games a year ago. Quarterback's back. Some key, kind of players are back. I think it's helpful for Indiana that game's at home. So your first big test, at least you're in front of your own crowd. Then, at least on paper, I think you have the easiest of the 3 difficult road games first. And so it's like, those first 5 games, it feels like, kind of set the terms for Indiana's season. If they're 3-2, then we're probably thinking about this team just kind of thrashing out bowl eligibility. If they're 4-1, then maybe it's kind of that sort of 8-9 win range, but not at the playoff level. I don't think it's unreasonable for them to think they can start 5-0. And if they are, then you get the week off. Then you go to Oregon. And so obviously that's, that might wind up being your most difficult. That might wind up being your most difficult game of the season. It's probably either Oregon or Penn State, at least based on what we know now. Then you get 2, on paper, manageable home games, Michigan State and UCLA, a manageable, again, on paper, road game at Maryland. And then that builds up to Penn State. And my point is, you can break the season up into these, like, comfortable sort of chunks. The first 5 games sort of maybe give us a sense for this team's floor. The Oregon game is our first look, depending on how the first 5 games have gone, at this team's ceiling. The 3 after that are games that if Indiana is as competitive as it was a year ago, it should probably win. And then you've got Penn State, a game that has the capacity to be one of the more important in the Big Ten race. We'll see. And then obviously you still got to finish against a Wisconsin team that I suspect is going to be better this year than it was last year. And I have no idea what Purdue is going to be. I really don't. But my point is the schedule kind of like, the example I use all the time is Kevin Wilson's first bowl season. They started 4-0, and then they lost 6 games in a row, and then they beat a bad Maryland team and a bad Purdue team. And they went to the Pinstripe Bowl. I have seen Indiana football schedules where there's just a section of the schedule that's so overloaded that you just can't manage it. And even if you win a couple of them, maybe you go 8-4 instead of going 10-2, or maybe you go 7-5 instead of going 9-3. This schedule, I think, it builds nicely. It's difficult in the right spots, but the pressure should also kind of relieve itself a little bit in the right spots for Indiana, whether it's out of the bye week at Oregon, whether it's building up to that Penn State game, to really kind of build itself to the biggest moments in the season. And I don't know I haven't really thought about like a projected win total. I'm sure that they will ask us to do that closer to the season. But if this is a season anywhere on par with last year, then I think part of it is going to wind up being that while this schedule is more difficult, I actually think navigating it is still somewhat favorable for Indiana, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that does. Hoop Ross is saying they need a signature win. I mean, is that just Penn State or Oregon? I mean, are those the options? Like, what counts as a signature win? Like, I mean, I think if Illinois and Iowa end up as 8-win teams, like those are good wins. I don't know. I just think that they can't have a schedule where it's just so like last year everything went poorly for the teams that are on their schedule. Like they want, I think, would you say higher floor than they had last year?
Yeah,
that's probably what you want from the schedule. Like I think Iowa on the road is a good win. I think it'll be looked at as a good win. Like that's not an easy place to play.
10-2 with this schedule puts you in the playoff conversation in a way that 10-2 with last year's schedule.
10-2 with losses to Oregon and Penn State.
I think so. I don't know that you're necessarily in, but I think you're in the conversation.
You're still in the discussion.
And like if let's say, so flip that around and say you lose at Iowa, but you beat Oregon. Like then I think you are. I mean, our good mutual friend out in Eugene could never see that happening, but it's like it is a schedule that's both harder and in a way a little bit more forgiving, because by the end of last season, like Hoop talks about a signature win. I mean, I would argue beating your rival 66-0, no matter how bad Purdue was, is awfully signature. But the problem was that by the end of the season, Indiana had to do that. There was no room for you can only win this game 35-14. They had to just absolutely bury everyone around them to convince people that it wasn't just the schedule they were a product of, but also their own quality. I think this schedule is potentially a little bit more forgiving, both in the way it plays out, because you do have some natural pauses in the rhythm of the season where there's a little bit of pressure off. Maybe you don't need to go to Maryland and win 49-0 to convince people that that you're good and that's a win worth considering. And also, I think it's a schedule that just kind of allows for a little bit more margin for error, basically, primarily because 3 of your 4 toughest games on paper are on the road.
Well, I think to your point, I think you could, I mean, it wouldn't speak to being able to do this, but if you lost the Illinois game, you could make it back. Yeah. Whereas last year you couldn't lose you couldn't lose to Washington, or you couldn't lose to Nebraska and make it back. Whereas I think this schedule you can.
Yeah. No, I agree with that.
And, I mean, it'll be difficult because that was, like you said, a home game early in the season. But I mean, you have 3 road opportunities after that. If you win 2 out of the 3 in terms of Penn State, Oregon, and Iowa, you're back in it. And you just didn't have that. I mean, you would have had to beat Ohio State last year. But like that, I mean, and that still might not have been enough if you had lost to a Northwestern or something like that. You know what I'm saying? Whereas this year, I think you have the quality. And
I mean, you can make the argument that like losing to Illinois and Iowa but beating Oregon and Penn State puts you in a better position for the playoff.
Yes. Yeah.
Assuming you win the other league, like assuming that you're a 10-win team.
Yeah.
You know, having wins of that quality. I mean, we'll see. But listen, I mean, and I don't think Indiana football should just sort of adopt a happy to be here stance. But the fact that we're talking about this, you know, I mean, I remember these conversations a year ago, you and I both being probably more optimistic than the national consensus about IU football. And we still landed. You had 8 wins. I had 9, both of us, including a bowl win. And we were both still just like, well, you know, it's really down to our belief in this coach and this staff and their track record of success. The idea that this is such a legitimate conversation a year later is maybe the greatest testament to just how much has changed because of this coach and his staff.
Was this what it was like after? I mean, because COVID was a fluke, right? Like, I mean, everything was the whole season. Not their season was a fluke, but it was such a fluky year that like it was hard to judge based like like success and like what was real and what wasn't. Were the discussion, because like obviously they had like just the bottom fell out, but like were the discussions like, is it the same optimism or is it different?
No, it's different. And listen, I mean, part of that team, number one, I think everyone recognized there was that inherent risk. Everyone hoped that all the optimism around Penix's recovery was legitimate and would prove founded. But in the back of your mind, you knew he's torn his ACL twice. Like there's a possibility.
So that was sort of the cloud hanging over the whole thing, more so than the COVID of it all. That what to judge of the team.
But I also think there was a real local national disconnect. Like when I talk to national people, they would say Indiana fans got to slow their roll. They're not ready to compete with Ohio State to win the Big Ten. And like Tom Allen said, our goal is to win the Big Ten. But like that's what a coach is supposed to do. He's supposed to set the bar incredibly high and push his team toward it. When I talk to people nationally, they said, Indiana fans got to calm down. And then when I talked to Indiana fans, they were saying, listen, 8 wins in a bowl game would be great because that's a level of sustained success that the program has rarely known. To be able to have a season like what Indiana did in 2019 and 2020, it should be said, COVID, I know they have more signature wins during the COVID season, but I always remind people that group also won 8 games and went to the Gator Bowl the year before. So that season did not come out of nowhere. That season was not a complete one-off that no one saw coming and was never going to be seen again. I think there is a more joined up local to national belief in what this program is capable of under this coaching staff and with all the resources that it has. And, we talked about the rev share number earlier. We know Indiana's NIL commitment in football has risen substantially in the last 18 months since Curt Cignetti was hired. I think there is more – I think there's probably more reason for optimism, frankly, just because you have 13 years of Curt Cignetti as a head coach, sustaining the success and building on it wherever he's been. But I also think there's just a more joined up – I think everyone kind of agrees on what is reasonable and what is possible a little bit more.
Do you see Penix's injury as a sliding doors moment? Like if he had been healthy?
I mean, it's tough to say because if he'd been completely healthy, you wonder if he wouldn't have tried to, go to the NBA. I'm still stuck in.
That would have been shocking.
It's just a remarkable turn of events. You wonder if he wouldn't have tried to go to the NFL, right? Like if he had completed that, because that was his 4th year in college. If he completed that COVID season, and let's say Indiana, with Michael Penix goes and wins the Outback Bowl, or maybe if Indiana has Michael, because Indiana was right on that cut line for like one of the last New Year's Six spots, maybe the committee thinks that Indiana with Michael Penix is more deserving of a New Year's Six spot. Maybe they go to Fiesta Bowl and win. Then maybe Michael Penix leaves. And then, maybe you don't quite get – and the other thing I would say too is you had a couple of guys on that team that I think also, because of the nature of that season, both all of what the COVID season entailed and also because of the way it ended, probably ran it back one more year in college when they wouldn't have otherwise. So again, if Penix stays healthy, if they finish that season on a higher note, let's say they win the Gator Bowl or the Outback Bowl, or let's say they go to the New Year's Six, I wonder if a couple of those other guys don't go to the NFL too. And then it is a very different conversation. So I mean, it's it's hard to say for sure. I will say it, even if you expected some regression or recognized that the schedule was harder, the idea that they were going to go, what did they finish, 2-10? And I think they only scored more than one offensive touchdown in one Big Ten game. I mean, like that, no one saw that coming. No one anticipated that kind of regression. I mean, it was just it was startling. And I think, and we're probably running back Indiana fans' worst nightmares here. I have said this before, and I stand by it. I don't think that team quit, but I think there was a sense when the terms of that season got reset and it stopped being, what if we could win 9-10 games and be the best Indiana football team ever? And all of us who came here to build this program into something, we bought into the idea that we were going to make it something it had never been before. We all kind of rode triumphantly out the door together. When it switched from that to like, let's try to just scrap and claw for 6 wins and get to a bowl game, I don't think that. I think a lot of guys just didn't have it in them to kind of reset their expectations. I think there was almost a feeling of like, well, I already did that. Like I already accomplished that here. I don't know if that team could reframe its mindset, once it was kind of clear that what the task at hand actually was going to be, basically. And I don't think you would get that from this team either. I don't, if this team started 3-2, I think it would still make a bowl game, because I think at the end of the day, there is just kind of like listen, we're here to win, and we're going to win as much as we can. And we'll be disappointed if we only go 7-5 and we thought we could go 9-3, but 7 wins is still more than 6 or 5 or 4 or 3 or 2 or 1. I think there's just
that's how math. That was some good stuff right there.
It was mathematics. Like that. I think there is a certain sort of ruthless efficiency about this group that's just a little bit different, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It's just curious. I mean, because obviously the historical compare. I mean, because that was obviously, a successful year, and they had lofty expectations within the program, but just an interesting comparison to see. Obviously, the quarterback situation is different, and they don't have that sort of hanging over their head this year in terms of injury. But obviously, they have a new guy. But just interesting to kind of compare. Get your perspective on that.
I did ask for questions on Twitter, and if we have any in the comments, just to kind of wrap up. This is one probably you're better equipped to answer than I am. The Seth Report on Twitter asked, what are some of the quotes or eye tests or national analyses, PFF, etc., that can provide comparison for where this team is compared to last year's team at this stage? And I think basically what Seth's asking is, are there marker data points or the way people are talking about this team that we can compare to where Indiana was a year ago? And I think we just touched on some of that, but I don't know if I know you really kind of the confidence or I know you comb through a lot of the PFF numbers. I was just curious if you had anything.
Well, I think you see, I don't know how many it was, but in terms of draft hopefuls, I think you've seen a lot more attention to Indiana's top guys. I think just the returning starter numbers, I think, is a huge point. I mean, last year this team had one guy, I think Linnell Carr was it. on defense, and then on the offensive line, you had a couple. But I mean, what this team is bringing back in terms of production and continuity, I think is sort of a big deal. I just think you've seen. There's no question now, because I think the biggest question facing this team last year was, can these guys that were in the Sun Belt and FCS sort of make the transition? And you got sort of a resounding answer. And so they haven't added a lot of guys that are making that jump. Most of the transfers they got now are guys from Power Four programs, like a Rylan Gandy from Pittsburgh, or the guys they got. I know the Kent State guy's an exception, but Marion, Kellen Wyatt, you're just guys that Holden Stace, guys that came from Power Five programs. So I don't think you have those kind of question marks all across the roster. Last year you did. I mean, basically at every position, it's like, well, if this guy's good, what about the secondary? What about the linebackers? I think it's more isolated across the roster of where the question marks are or who they are. I just think that's such a big deal. Their hit rate last year was phenomenal in terms of transfers and guys making the jump. Some of that had to do with bringing over that large number of James Madison guys, but I think that now you're seeing that represented nationally too, in terms of beyond Mendoza, guys getting some draft attention. I do think you have Carter Smith's a guy I think is there, Kamara, Aiden Fisher, and Pons. I mean, those are all guys that I think are going to be in that discussion after the season. So I think you've seen those sort of markers. And look, to me, this team, where are the question marks? I like I said, staying healthy, because I think as in this era, it's really hard to build depth. And, we're trying to have resource management and balancing that, I think, is tough. And then, having a roster that 18 months ago had only 40 people on it, or 45 people. It's not easy to have that second group. And so I think that's sort of like what I mentioned last year. They got so lucky with lacking major injuries, across the board. I think it's just gonna be just as important. I think they have more depths in certain spots, like offensive line, I think is a lot better in terms of depth. I think their secondary is, but you lose an Aiden Fisher, it's going to be hard to come back. You lose Kamara, those are injuries that I just think are irreplaceable, and obviously based on their talent, but just behind them, you just don't have the guys.
One of my favorite posters at Buff Komodo, I assume he means the Dragon, asked, will there be any all-name team candidates on the roster or notable nicknames to be aware of? I mean, I'm scrolling through it right now. The two that jumped out to me are, number one, I think we can all see coming from 10 miles away some sort of James Bond crossover if LeBron Bond turns out to be a good player. He's only a freshman. It seemed like he did have a good spring, and Indiana's going to need some help in the slot, but I don't know if we'll see a lot of him this year. I mean, the holdover from last year that in terms of all-name team that I love is Solomon Van Horst, especially because he is your returner. The idea that your returner's name is Van Horst.
You missed the one that is your favorite, actually.
Well, that's true. Bones Jones. To be fair, I hadn't gotten that far on the roster. If the roster cap had been initiated by now, then I would have gotten further down the roster. But because all these players got grandfathered in, Bones Jones can be. The problem is you need people outside of the facility to call him Bones Jones. And I don't know how we make that happen, but you need people. You need people outside the facility
buying in. You need to an NIL deal of sorts to get the clearinghouse.
The other one, Adedemola Ajani, I believe is how we pronounce it. He's a redshirt freshman offensive lineman from Indianapolis. I do actually think you're going to hear his name a little bit this season, and that'll depend in part on the health of the offensive line in front of him. But he was probably the furthest along of the very young linemen based on what we saw last year. And my sense is he's really continued to improve. He's more of an interior guy, I think. We haven't seen him a lot, really at all, I think, in games. So I think he may have appeared in 1 or 2 last year, like maintaining his red shirt. I don't want to sit here and say he's absolutely this position or that position because I think he's still young and developing, but he's one that I would keep an eye on just in terms of like who are the next guys in that offensive line room. I think he could be one.
Yeah.
This appears to be the last question, and I just lost it. Well, I want to make sure I get who asked it. At Cheesy3 said, "What beers are we drinking this summer?" And then responded, "Cold ones is correct, but disqualified as an answer for now."
Is that it? I thought
that's your question.
That's my question. I'm drinking whiskey.
Yeah, I don't really drink beer anymore. I do like last night I stopped and got some Modelo after I played soccer because like a really cold Modelo on a hot day is refreshing to me. But
I thought you were drinking, was it Coors Light in Oklahoma City or was it Michelob Light or what were you drinking?
Coors Light.
Weren't you drinking a light beer in Oklahoma City?
No.
Oh, after Little 5. That's what you're drinking.
No, I don't know. I don't know. You're going back, months, if not years. That's right. I'm glad we ended our first podcast in like 2 months that way. He's Mike Niziolek. I'm Zach Osterman. Thank you all so much for listening. I promise it won't be such a long gap. We'll probably start doing especially some kind of football buildup in July. I know we've still got both of us a little bit more vacation to take, but maybe some more kind of targeted conversations around certain positions, certain sort of elements of this team's profile as we build toward Big Ten Media Days and then the season. But for now, for the Star, for the Herald Times, this has been Mind Your Banners for June 25th, 2025. Thank you so much for listening. Talk to you soon.